What you are about to hear is a story that has been whispered in the darkest corners of our town for generations. A tale of a family, their trade, and a secret that refused to stay buried. The details are not for the faint of heart, but for those who seek the truth, no matter how grotesque it may be. Before we delve into the shadows, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you don't miss out on the chilling stories we uncover. Now, let's begin the story of the family of butchers for 3 generations and the day their legacy was stained with the discovery of human remains in a pork barrel. The town of Havenwood was a place where time seemed to move at a slower pace. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense, whispering woods, it was a community built on tradition and heritage. At the heart of this town, on the corner of Main and Elm, stood a brick building with a faded sign that read, "Cleavers meets the finest cuts since 1923. For a century, the Cleaver family had been the town's butchers, a lineage of skilled hands and sharp knives that had fed generations of Havenwood's residents. The townsfolk would often say, "If it's meat you want, you go to Cleavers. They know their craft." And they did. The Cleavers were more than just butchers. They were artisans of their trade. The story of Cleavers Meats began with Elias Cleaver, a man with a stern face and hands as tough as the leather apron he wore. He had arrived in Havenwood with nothing but a set of well-honed knives and a dream of building something that would last. And he had succeeded. Cleavers Meats became a cornerstone of the community, a place where people would not only buy their roasts and sausages, but also exchange gossip and share stories. Elias was a man of few words, but his work spoke for him. His cuts were precise, his sausages were legendary, and his cured hams were the pride of Havenwood. He passed his knowledge and his passion down to his son, Samuel, who, in turn, passed it down to his own son, Thomas. Thomas Cleaver was the current proprietor of Cleavers Meats. He was a man in his late 50s, with a kind face and the same strong hands as his grandfather. He had grown up in the butcher shop, the scent of sawdust and fresh meat a constant in his life. He had learned the trade from his father, just as his father had learned it from his. The shop was more than just a business to Thomas. It was his family's legacy. He took immense pride in continuing the tradition, in providing the people of Havenwood with the same quality and service that his grandfather had established all those years ago. The butcher shop itself was a relic of a bygone era. The floors were covered in a thick layer of sawdust, replaced fresh every morning. The walls were adorned with old photographs of the Cleaver men, each one standing proudly in front of the shop, a cleaver in hand. The centerpiece of the shop was the massive wooden butcher block, worn smooth and concave from a century of use. It was on this block that 3 generations of Cleavers had carved their place in Havenwood's history. Behind the counter, a large walk-in cooler hummed, its shelves lined with sides of beef, whole lambs, and pigs hanging from hooks. The year was 2023, the centennial of Cleavers Meats. Thomas had been planning a celebration for months. He wanted to honor his grandfather's legacy and thank the town for a century of loyalty. The celebration was to be a grand affair, a town-wide barbecue with free food and live music. In preparation for the event, Thomas had decided to do a deep clean of the shop, to get into every nook and cranny that had been neglected over the years. It was a task he had been putting off for a long time, but the centennial felt like the right occasion for it. The back of the shop was a labyrinth of storage rooms and cellars, places that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. It was in one of these cellars, a damp, stone-walled room that was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the shop, that Thomas made the discovery that would unravel the carefully constructed history of his family and his town. The cellar was filled with old equipment, rusted tools, and barrels of all shapes and sizes. Most of the barrels were empty, their contents long since used or spoiled. But one barrel, tucked away in the darkest corner of the cellar, was different. It was an old pork barrel, made of thick, dark wood and bound with rusted iron hoops. It was much heavier than the others, and when Thomas tried to move it, he heard a strange sloshing sound from within. Curiosity piqued. He took a crowbar and pried open the lid. The stench that hit him was immediate and overwhelming. It was a putrid, gag-inducing odor, a a smell of decay and rot that was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his years as a butcher. He stumbled back, covering his nose and mouth with his hand. His first thought was that a rat or some other vermin had gotten trapped inside and died. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light of the cellar, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Submerged in a thick, dark brine were what looked like bones. They were too large to be from any animal he was familiar with. And then he saw it, a human skull, its empty eye sockets staring up at him from the murky depths of the barrel. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled out of the cellar, gasping for fresh air, his mind reeling from what he had just seen. For a moment, he stood there in the back alley behind the shop, leaning against the cold brick wall, trying to process the horror of his discovery. This couldn't be real. It had to be a mistake, a trick of the light. But the image of the skull was burned into his memory, a gruesome specter that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He knew what he had to do. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the Havenwood Police Department. The arrival of the police shattered the tranquility of Havenwood. The flashing blue and red lights of the squad cars reflected off the windows of the old buildings, casting an eerie glow on the familiar streets. The yellow police tape that cordoned off Cleaver's Meats was a stark and jarring sight in the heart of the town. The news spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones in the cafes, the post office, and the town square. Human remains found at Cleaver's. The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief and a morbid curiosity. The investigation was led by Detective Miles Corbin, a man who had seen his fair share of darkness in his career. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found in the cellar of Cleaver's Meats. The barrel was carefully hoisted out of the cellar and transported to the county morgue. The forensic team, led by Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a sharp and inquisitive mind, began the meticulous process of examining the contents. What they found was a jumble of human bones, all belonging to a single individual. The bones were discolored and brittle from years of being submerged in the brine. Dr. Thorne and his team carefully cleaned and cataloged each bone, trying to piece together the story of the person who had met such a gruesome end. The skull was mostly intact, and they were able to determine that the victim was a male, likely in his late 20s or early 30s. The cause of death was not immediately apparent, but there were signs of trauma. A closer examination of the ribs revealed several fractures, and there was a small, circular hole in the skull, just above the left temple. It was a bullet hole. As the forensic team continued their work, Detective Corbin began his investigation into the history of the Cleaver family. He started with Thomas, who was in a state of shock. Thomas told him everything he knew about the shop, about his father and grandfather. He spoke of them with reverence, describing them as hard-working, honest men who were pillars of the community. He couldn't imagine either of them being capable of such a monstrous act. Corbin then turned his attention to the town's archives, to the old newspapers and records that held the history of Havenwood. He was looking for any mention of a missing person, a cold case, anything that might connect to the remains found in the barrel. He spent days poring over dusty records, his eyes straining in the dim light of the archive room. And then he found it. It was a small article, tucked away in the back pages of the Havenwood Gazette, dated October 31st, 1923. The headline read, "Local Man Vanishes Without a Trace." The article told the story of a man named William Billy O'Connell, a young man who had recently moved to Havenwood. He was a charming and charismatic individual, known for his quick wit and his love of a good time. He had been working as a farmhand on the outskirts of town and was a regular at the local saloon. The last time anyone had seen him was on a Saturday night, leaving the saloon with a woman whose identity was unknown. He was reported missing a few days later when he failed to show up for work. The police had conducted a search, but no trace of him was ever found. The case eventually went cold, another unsolved mystery in the annals of Havenwood's history. The date of the article, 1923, was the same year that Elias Cleaver had opened his butcher shop. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Corbin had a feeling, a gut instinct that told him he was on the right track. He now had a name for the man in the barrel, but he still had to answer the most important questions. Who had killed Billy O'Connell and why? The investigation took a darker turn as Corbin delved deeper into the life of Elias Cleaver. He interviewed some of the older residents of Havenwood, people whose parents and grandparents had known Elias. A picture began to emerge of a man who was not the benevolent patriarch that Thomas had described. Elias was a hard man, a man with a quick temper and a jealous streak. He was known to be possessive of his wife, a beautiful woman named Clara. Corbin discovered that Clara Cleaver had a secret. Before she had married Elias, she had been in love with another man, a man who had left Havenwood to seek his fortune elsewhere. That man was Billy O'Connell. He had returned to Havenwood in the fall of 1923, hoping to rekindle his romance with Clara. But by then, she was already married to Elias. A new narrative began to take shape, a story of love, jealousy, and murder. Had Elias Cleaver discovered the affair between his wife and her former lover? Had he, in a fit of rage, killed Billy O'Connell and hidden his body in the one place no one would ever think to look? The theory was plausible, but Corbin needed more than just a theory. He needed proof. The proof came from an unexpected source. Dr. Thorne, in his examination of the bones, had found something lodged in one of the vertebrae. It was a small, metallic object, no bigger than a grain of rice. It was a bullet fragment. The ballistics team was able to match the fragment to a specific type of handgun, a Colt .32, a popular model in the 1920s. Corbin returned to the butcher shop, this time with a search warrant. He and his team scoured every inch of the old building, from the attic to the cellar. They pulled up floorboards, they tore down walls, they searched for any hidden compartments or secret passages. And then, in a small, locked room in the back of the shop, a room that Thomas had always been told was for storage, they found it. It was an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The journal belonged to Elias Cleaver. The journal was a chilling account of a man consumed by jealousy and rage. Elias had written about his suspicions of Clara's infidelity, about his growing hatred for Billy O'Connell. He had followed them, he had spied on them, his paranoia twisting his love for his wife into a possessive obsession. And then, on the night of October 31st, 1923, he had confronted them. The final entry in the journal was a confession. Elias had described in cold, methodical detail how he had shot Billy O'Connell in the back of the head. He had then brought the body back to the butcher shop, where he had dismembered it and placed the remains in a pork barrel, filling it with brine to preserve the evidence of his crime. He had hidden the barrel in the cellar, a dark secret that he would take to his grave. The discovery of the journal sent a shockwave through Havenwood. The story of the town's founding father, the man who had built a legacy of trust and quality, was a lie. The name Cleaver, once a symbol of respect and tradition, was now synonymous with murder and deceit. The town was forced to confront a dark chapter in its history, a secret that had been buried for a century. For Thomas Cleaver, the revelation was a devastating blow. The man he had admired his entire life, the grandfather he had looked up to as a role model, was a monster. The butcher shop, the place he had called home, was a crime scene. His family's legacy was not one of pride, but of shame. The centennial celebration was cancelled. The sign that had hung above the shop for 100 years was taken down. Cleaver's Meats was closed for good. The town of Havenwood was left to grapple with the truth. The story of the butcher family and the human remains in the pork barrel became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the most idyllic of places, darkness can lurk beneath the surface. The whispering woods that surrounded the town seemed to carry the story on the wind, a chilling echo of a secret that had finally been unearthed. The revelations about Elias Cleaver and the murder of Billy O'Connell had left a deep and festering wound on the town of Havenwood. The once revered name of Cleaver was now spoken in hushed and scandalized tones. The butcher shop, which had been the heart of the community for a century, stood empty and silent, a monument to a dark and violent past. For Thomas Cleaver, the weight of his family's history was a crushing burden. He had become a recluse, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the ghost of a grandfather he had never truly known. But the story was far from over. The discovery of Elias Cleaver's journal had answered the question of who had killed Billy O'Connell, but it had also raised new and disturbing questions. The journal was not just a confession. It was a window into the mind of a killer, a man who had meticulously planned and executed a murder, and then had gone on to live the rest of his life as a respected member of the community. How had he been able to live with such a dark secret? And was he the only one who knew? Detective Corbin was not satisfied with the simple narrative of a jealous husband and a crime of passion. There were details in the journal that didn't add up, inconsistencies that hinted at a larger and more sinister story. Elias had written about his wife, Clara, but his words were filled with a strange mixture of love and resentment. He had described her as both a victim and a temptress, an innocent caught in a web of deceit, and a willing participant in her own betrayal. Corbin's investigation now focused on Clara Cleaver. She had died in the 1950s, so he couldn't question her directly. But he could talk to the people who had known her, the few remaining residents of Havenwood who remembered the butcher's wife. They described her as a quiet and reserved woman, beautiful but sad, with a melancholic air about her. She was a devoted wife and mother, but there was always a sense of distance, as if she were living in a world of her own. One of the people Corbin interviewed was an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who had been a close friend of Clara's. She was in her 90s, her mind still sharp, her memory a treasure trove of Havenwood's history. She remembered Clara as a kind and gentle soul, a woman who had been deeply unhappy in her marriage. She told Corbin that Clara had confided in her, that she had been afraid of her husband. Elias was a controlling and possessive man, she said, who had isolated Clara from her friends and family. Mrs. Gable also told Corbin something that had never been mentioned in any of the official records. Clara had been pregnant at the time of Billy O'Connell's disappearance. She had later suffered a miscarriage, an event that had sent her into a deep depression from which she had never fully recovered. The timing of the pregnancy was suspicious. Could the child have been Billy's? Had Elias's jealousy been fueled by the fear that his wife was carrying another man's child? The investigation took another turn when Dr. Thorne, who had been re-examining the remains from the barrel, made a new discovery. He had been conducting a more detailed analysis of the bones, using advanced techniques to extract DNA. He had been able to get a partial DNA profile from the remains of Billy O'Connell. He then asked for a DNA sample from Thomas Cleaver. The results were shocking. Thomas Cleaver was not the grandson of Elias Cleaver. He was the grandson of Billy O'Connell. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Samuel Cleaver, Thomas's father, was not Elias's son. He was the son of Billy and Clara. The truth was far more complex and tragic than anyone had imagined. Clara had indeed been pregnant with Billy's child. Elias had found out, and in a jealous rage he had killed Billy. But he had not been able to bring himself to harm Clara or the unborn child. Instead, he had raised Samuel as his own son, a constant reminder of his wife's betrayal. He had forced Clara to live with the secret, to raise her lover's child as the son of her husband, the man who had murdered her lover. The discovery of the truth about his parentage was another devastating blow for Thomas. He had spent his entire life believing he was a Cleaver, that he was carrying on the legacy of his father and grandfather. Now, he was forced to confront the fact that his entire identity was a lie. He was the grandson of a murdered man, and the son of a woman who had been forced to live a lie. The town of Havenwood was once again thrown into turmoil. The story of the Cleaver family was no longer just a story of murder. It was a story of a family torn apart by secrets and lies, a story of a woman who had been a prisoner in her own home, and a man who had been raised by his father's killer. As the town struggled to come to terms with the truth, a new mystery emerged. If Elias had been so consumed by jealousy and rage, why had he spared Samuel's life? Why had he raised the child of his rival as his own son? The answer, Corbin believed, was in the journal. He went back to the old, leather-bound book, reading it again and again, searching for any clue that might explain Elias's actions. And then he found it in a passage that he had previously overlooked. Elias had written about his own childhood, about his own father, a man who had been a cruel and abusive tyrant. Elias had grown up in fear of his father, a man who had taught him that love was a weakness, and that violence was the only way to control the people around you. Elias had sworn that he would never be like his father, that he would never raise a child in fear. In a strange and twisted way, Elias had seen Samuel as a chance for redemption. By raising the boy as his own, he was trying to break the cycle of violence that had been passed down through his own family. He was trying to be a better father than his own had been. But he was also a prisoner of his own jealousy and rage, a man who had been so consumed by his own demons that he had been unable to see the pain he was inflicting on the people he claimed to love. The story of the Cleaver family was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a tale of love, betrayal, and the destructive power of secrets. It was a story that would be told in Havenwood for generations to come, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic of towns. The butcher shop on the corner of Main and Elm remained empty, a silent testament to the family that had once been the heart of the community. The name Cleaver was no longer a symbol of pride, but a reminder of the sins of the father and the secrets that had been buried for a century. Thomas Cleaver eventually left Havenwood, unable to bear the weight of his family's history. He sold the butcher shop to a developer, who tore it down and built a modern apartment complex in its place. The town tried to move on, to forget the dark chapter in its history. But the story of the butcher family and the human remains in the pork barrel was a story that could not be forgotten. It was a story that was woven into the very fabric of the town, a story that would be whispered in the shadows for years to come. Years passed, and the town of Havenwood slowly began to heal from the wounds of the Cleaver family scandal. The empty lot where the butcher shop had once stood was now a small park, a place where children played and couples walked hand in hand. The story of the butcher and the barrel had become a local legend, a ghost story told around campfires and on late-night walks. The younger generation knew it only as a tale, a piece of local folklore, but for the older residents, the memory of the events was still fresh, a scar on the town's collective consciousness. Thomas Cleaver had never returned to Havenwood. He had moved to a city far away, where no one knew his name or his family's history. He had tried to start a new life, to escape the shadows of his past. But the ghosts of his ancestors were not so easily shaken. He was haunted by the faces of the people he had never known, the grandfather who was a murderer, and the grandfather who was a victim. He was a man without a history, a man whose life had been built on a foundation of lies. One day, Thomas received a letter. It was from a law firm in Havenwood, informing him that he was the sole heir to the estate of a woman he had never heard of, Eleanor Gable. The name was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He called the law firm, and they told him that Eleanor Gable was the elderly woman who had been a friend of his grandmother, Clara. She had passed away at the age of 102, and she had left him a small inheritance. But there was more. She had also left him a box, with a note that said it was for his eyes only. Curiosity got the better of him. He drove back to Havenwood, a town he had sworn he would never see again. The town had changed, but the ghosts were still there. He could feel them in the whisper of the wind, in the shadows of the old buildings. He went to the law firm and picked up the box. It was an old wooden box, bound with a leather strap. He took it back to his hotel room and opened it. Inside the box were a collection of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were written in a delicate, looping script, the ink faded with age. They were love letters, written by his grandmother, Clara, to his grandfather, Billy O'Connell. The letters told a story of a love that was passionate and forbidden, a love that had been cut short by a jealous husband. But there was another set of letters in the box, letters that Clara had written to her friend, Eleanor. In these letters, Clara had poured out her heart, her fear of her husband, her guilt over her affair, and her love for her unborn child. She had written about the night of the murder, about how Elias had come home with blood on his hands, and how she had known, in that moment, that her life would never be the same. The letters revealed a side of Clara that Thomas had never known. She was not just a victim. She was a woman who had been trapped in an impossible situation, a woman who had made a difficult choice to protect her child. She had stayed with Elias, not out of love, but out of fear. She had raised her son in the house of his father's killer, a secret that she had carried to her grave. But the most shocking revelation was in the final letter. It was a letter that Clara had written to Eleanor just before she died. In it, she confessed to her role in the murder of Billy O'Connell. She had not been a passive bystander. She had been a participant. She had lured Billy to a secluded spot where Elias was waiting for him. She had been there when Elias had pulled the trigger. She had helped him dispose of the body. The confession was a final, devastating blow for Thomas. His grandmother, the woman he had imagined as a tragic victim, was a murderer. The story of his family was not a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a story of flawed and broken people who had been driven to do terrible things by their passions and their fears. Thomas didn't know what to do with the letters. He could burn them and let the secrets die with his grandmother. Or he could share them and let the world know the whole ugly truth. He chose the latter. He gave the letters to a local historian, a woman who was writing a book about the history of Havenwood. The book was published a year later, and it caused a sensation. The story of the Cleaver family was once again the talk of the town, but this time it was a different story. It was a story that was more complex, more tragic, and more human. It was a story that forced the people of Havenwood to confront the uncomfortable truth that there is a little bit of darkness in all of us. The park where the butcher shop had once stood became a place of reflection, a place where people would come to remember the story of the Cleaver family. A small plaque was erected, with the names of all the people who had been touched by the tragedy: Elias, Clara, Billy, Samuel, and Thomas. The plaque was a reminder that the past is never truly dead, that it lives on in the stories we tell, and in the echoes that it leaves behind. Thomas Cleaver finally found a measure of peace. He had confronted the ghosts of his past, and he had come to terms with the truth of his family's history. He was no longer a man without a history. He was a man who had a story to tell, a story of love, loss, and the enduring power of the human spirit. He stayed in Havenwood, and he became a part of the community that he had once tried to escape. He became a storyteller, a keeper of the town's history, and a guardian of the echoes of the past. And in the telling of the story, he found a way to heal the wounds of the past, and to build a new future, a future that was free from the shadows of the Cleaver family.